All right, hey everyone. So the last videos that we're going to be talking about, or that I'm going to be sharing with you, are to talk about The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So similar to looking at O'Connor's story Parker's Back, we want to look at the body, the grotesque, and the marriage relationship between the characters in this story. And so I'll address some of those topics. Once again, just the things that I found interesting, the things that stood out to me and what I noticed, and pointing out some different elements of the story. So please have your copy with you so that you can look through as I go through some of the quotations and make any notes that you want to make, or see some of the things that you noticed and how they compare. So the first thing I want to talk about in this story is the grotesque and the role of the body. I blended the two together because they're such significant themes, and the element of the grotesque is deeply rooted in Georgiana's body and the birthmark that she has. And so even from the first page, which is quite a small little chunk, the defining feature of Georgiana is that she's beautiful. It's the first thing that we learn about her. About halfway through that first paragraph, it says, quote, that Aylmer had persuaded a beautiful woman to become his wife. The only descriptor of her is that she's beautiful and she's a woman, and that he asked her to marry him. So right from the get-go, we're learning that that's a really important part about her. The second thing that we learn about her, so on page 262, immediately after that opening paragraph, is that she has a mark on her cheek. So we know she's beautiful, but she's got a mark on her cheek. And on page 262, it says, quote, "Has it ever occurred to you that the mark upon your cheek might be removed?" End quote. So that's Aylmer talking to his wife, Georgiana. So even the way that it's introduced, this is a mark that he doesn't like, and we know it's something that he wants removed, and that's how it's introduced to us. So thinking about the grotesque as things that are off-putting, that make us uncomfortable, this mark on Georgiana's face is something that we find out right away to Aylmer is unpleasant, and he's asking her if she wants it removed. Now, I thought it was really interesting because later on that page 262, we get a descriptor from the narrator of the mark on Georgiana's face, and it in no way indicates that it's an ugly birthmark. And Georgiana even refers to it as, quote, a charm on page 262 when she's talking about how other gentlemen have seen the mark on her face before, and that's what they've noticed in it. And so when we see Aylmer's response, "Do you want it removed?" She smiles, no, like, I've never thought about it. It's a charm. And it's described to us by the narrator as, quote, "a singular mark, deeply interwoven, as it were, with the texture and substance of her face, in the usual state of her complexion, a healthy," so that's one of the descriptors, "though delicate bloom," even a bloom, it's like a flower. "The mark wore a tint of deeper crimson, which imperfectly defined its shape amid the surrounding rosiness." So, okay, the words the narrator's describing doesn't give us any indication that it's ugly or grotesque. It is imperfect, which that's neither here nor there in terms of a description, because it is a mark on her face. But it's this bloom, it's almost this flower image on her face. And a little bit further down that page as well, it's described as, quote, "a fairy sign." So it's actually described with pleasantness, almost this sort of magical quality to Georgiana. And yet we find out from Aylmer's perspective. So first off, he asked the question about having it removed. We have that introduced to us. And then on page 263, so after we've been given this other description by the narrator then says, quote, "Seeing her otherwise so perfect, he," being Aylmer, "found this one defect grow more and more intolerable with every moment of their united lives." End quote. So from his perspective, Georgiana's beauty, this thing that is assumedly one of the reasons he married her, because it was the only descriptor we were given when we were told that he asked her to marry him, this mark on her face, on her left cheek, is becoming so abhorrent to him, so grotesque, that it's becoming intolerable in their life together. It's impacting their marriage relationship, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But I asked the question, I was like, how do we respond to something like this as a 21st century audience? And I'm going to talk a little bit about satire and about mockery, because I think that Hawthorne is playing with that a little bit, specifically around science and the scientific method, which is interwoven with Aylmer's response to Georgiana's birthmark. However, for me as a woman reading this, that there would be a male character who would find this one feature on an otherwise beautiful woman so abhorrent that he's letting it impact their entire life seems ridiculous to me. And I'm curious how a 19th century audience, because this story was published in 1843, what their response would have been to that. That would have been different from mine. And we see here, and I'll talk about this more later, how this is indicative. Aylmer's response to her birthmark is indicative of their relational dynamic, with him fixating on this one flaw that she has, and that keeps coming up again and again, and becomes the defining feature, not only of her physical features, but of their relationship. So this line on page 263 I thought was so appropriate as we're talking about the grotesque. We're talking about this idea of beauty and ugliness, and how they're representatives of trying to make us think about something else, or put us in a position of discomfort so we're aware of other things. So on page 263, this is the description of Aylmer's view of the birthmark that goes beyond just the physical description. So, quote, selecting it as the symbol of his wife's liability to sin, sorrow, decay, and death, Aylmer's somber imagination was not long in rendering the birthmark a frightful object, causing him more trouble and horror than ever Georgiana's beauty had given him delight. End quote. So we see at this point that the birthmark is more than just a physical imperfection that Aylmer is seeing and thinks is unpleasant to look at. He actually sees it as a symbol of his wife's sin, of her, in many ways, humanity, because to sin, and as we see it, is to be human. That's a part of who we are, that we're imperfect. We aren't these perfect creations. And yet for Aylmer in this story, this physical image is calling to him all of these other ethereal horrors that are not physical, that are not a part of the physical realm, but of the spiritual realm. And so he is looking at her, and we're seeing that there's no longer any separation, like the body and the soul or the heart are completely enmeshed. He sees this, and this is supported again on page 264. Because we're here that Aylmer has imagined operating on Georgiana to remove the birthmark. And in his imaginings, we are told this, quote, but the deeper went the knife, the deeper sank the hand, until at length its tiny grasp appeared to have caught hold of Georgiana's heart. End quote. So in his imaginings, he actually sees this physical birthmark going inside of her, deeper and deeper and deeper into her heart, that they are enmeshed, they are connected, which arguably is one of the reasons he wants to get rid of it, no longer just for its physical and visual unpleasantness to him, but because of this deeper rooted meaning that he's created in this image. And one of the really interesting aspects that we see too, we have a very clear picture of Aylmer's view of the birthmark and how he feels about it. But the element that changes is Georgiana's view. So from her opening perspective, to smile when he asks her if she wants it removed, to have called it a charm, her relationship to the birthmark progressively gets worse and worse, and we see her reactions become more abhorrent, and she starts to, her view of herself, her view of her body changes, and she sees the grotesqueness not only in the mark but in herself. So one of the first times we see this is on page 266. It says, quote, she placed her hand over her cheek to hide the terrible mark from her husband's eyes. So initially there, end quote, she's just trying to hide it from her husband. She knows he doesn't like it, but she's actually physically doing something in order to save him from having to look at her face. and she's trying to hide that part of herself. And then it grows on page 267, quote, "At the mention of the birthmark, Georgiana, as usual, shrank as if a red hot iron had touched her cheek," end quote. That hasn't got anything to do with Aylmer. It's just the mention of the birthmark, and she seems to have this even stronger, almost visceral reaction, like a red hot iron has touched her cheek, and she is responding to her own imperfection, to the grotesqueness of her body. And that continues to grow. Page 268, quote, "Not even Aylmer now hated it so much as she," end quote. So she is now the one who actually is a driving force in this. She hates it so much. And we've seen this progression throughout her in this story. And to the point that we see on page 270, this is an interesting statement for a couple of reasons. So I'll read the quote and then I'll talk about it. Quote, "I knew not the height and depth of your nature until now." This is Aylmer speaking to Georgiana. "Know then that this crimson hand, superficial as it seems, has clutched its grasp into your being," end quote. It's really hard to read these without feeling dramatic. So we see in this moment, and this is just shortly before Georgiana takes the poison that does remove the hand and kill her at the same time. So we see in her being willing to drink this poison, and she says, "I will do anything. It doesn't matter what the cost." He makes the statement that "I didn't know the height and depth of your nature until now." So it's this tension between, in her being willing to reject her body so fully, he calls that nature and character. And he says he's seeing a side of her that he never saw before, that this pursuit of physical perfection is this height of character in her that he couldn't see before. He couldn't see past that birthmark. And we also see that this idea that he had felt that her birthmark was connected to her heart, because he's been trying things, and Georgiana didn't even know everything that he was doing. But he has seen how deep this birthmark goes, and that it is, in fact, connected to her being. It's a part of her soul, her heart, her essence. It's not just this physical feature on her face. And so at the end, in her perfection of having the birthmark removed, Georgiana is free from the birthmark. But when she's free from it, it's a part of her, it's a part of her soul, it's a part of her heart. She dies. And that we were given this quote on page 272, the last page, quote, "The mark was the bond by which an angelic spirit kept itself in union with the mortal frame," end quote. This thing that was meant to be grotesque, meant to be ugly, it was not death, it was life. It was the thing that gave her life. It was so deeply connected to who she was. And so we see this tension that's being experienced between beauty and ugliness, and outward and inward, and body and spirit. And all of these dichotomies are at play in this story. And so I'm going to pause here. I'll talk about the marriage relationship and the scientific method and how that comes into play in the second video. Thanks so much.